Hello, everyone, and welcome to another GoMobi.work weekly coaching conversation. Each week, we bring you a topic in employee performance development, leadership, and what you can do with your team to make it a happy, thriving place. And this week, we have a very special guest, Elaine Chung. She is a play expert and founder of My Play Type. This is actually the second episode we're doing in a row with Elaine, because when we were prepping for all these meetings and all this and this particular workshop, we realized we have way too much material to do one session alone. So we are very happy to be joined by Elaine today. My name is Wade Bruffy. I'm the co-founder and CEO of GoMobi.work. I'm joined also by our co-founder, Zoltan Sarda.
Hey, everyone. Glad you could join us. And Elaine, I'm really looking forward to this talk. This is one of my deep core passions in life and thinking about human development. So really looking forward to this.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming back, Elaine.
Absolutely.
So we had a lot of stuff that we were talking about before, but Zoltan, was something coming to your mind there?
No, I just think, I think there were a couple of things in our little pre-talk that we just had that 5 minutes, we covered a lot of topics. But I think this idea that a lot of leaders know that play is important, the concept of play and leading employees to that, supporting that in their work, but not knowing how, or being sort of stuck in old ways of doing things. And I just love to hear maybe start there with like a big overview. It's like what are some of the things that you're seeing out there that both foster and inhibit a culture of play in organizations?
Yeah. I think the first layer, which is a big layer, is there's this almost like stigma of what play is, that it's kids, it's a kids thing, it's less important. And then as I had interviewed a good number of executives on like what they're thinking of play was, it's this common theme that it's like on top of work, that it's not a way to work, but some additional thing. And after you do that additional thing, whether it be team outing or play the foosball table, you still have work to do. And so that fundamental, I think that first layer is getting rid of that. And we did talk last time, there's a lot of shoulds that exist for individuals, from organizations, that are all embedded from societal side, cultural side, and even individual experiences side. But recognizing that play doesn't have to actually be something that's loud and boisterous and clown-like and running around or anything like that, but play is a fundamental way to think about things, and understanding the neuroscience of it, just even how the brain works when we are at play. Like, new pathways are growing, and when you think about, at the end of the day, a lot of businesses and organizations, we're wanting to include diversification of ideas, new ideas, and creating that requires us to think a little bit differently. And when our brains think a little bit differently, that's also because of those new pathways that have built. And so that's probably the main kind of like stigma, I would say, that prevents folks from recognizing like, oh, this is actually a different way of thinking. But that's also why I'm here, like helping to help organizations understand like how. And we talked a little bit first on the how is from the base level. I do get a lot of inspiration from my kids, and like being curious about things, like asking a little bit more from each other, but also the problem at hand. I could think of, let's say, recently there was this client I had, and there was this I had a comment she was making as she was doing reviews, saying like, I just saw like, well, why are they doing that? And she only asked the why, like, why are they doing it that way? And I posed a question back to her of like, well, like when we think back, like what other questions could we actually ask about the situation or the environment? And it was turned into like, let's frame it as like, I wonder why. Like, why did they actually think about this? I wonder why. Like, what inputs actually fed into this conclusion that they came up with? So instead of going after like, why did they do that? Kind of the attacking on the they, like inquiring further. And yeah, Wade brought up the kind of like multi-level of asking questions, whereas like when we do the five whys, we just go one directional. Um, I apologize. I can't remember the phrasing of it, but it's
Yep.
kind of like in this situation too. It's like feeding in, like there are other levels. Like, and yes, it's a why still when you say, I wonder why, but I wonder why helps you understand the circumstances around it so that you can then find out, it's because um, this other input fed into their conclusion and that's why, and things like that. So,
Absolutely. And I wonder with that, I think part of, in my experience, I think part of what we're looking at is what the concept of productivity is, and I think, that idea that like when you're talking about how play is put on top of other things, right? It's like an extra. But we don't see that as a productive space in some ways. We see it as like, maybe it's culture building, maybe it's team building or something, but it's not the work that that is actually productive. And it's just how you sort of frame that for folks. Like to me, the idea of building new neural pathways is highly productive, but but you can see it, like it's not on a spreadsheet.
yeah, I get it. Yeah. Well, like when we think about play, yes, the neural networks, that's more the science side of like why it actually works on the productivity level. And different organizations can define, and even different people can define productivity in different ways. If it is idea generation, there you go, right? Like those new pathways, thinking about it a different way, creating nurturing environments for that level of collaboration that we touched on last week too. Critical to productivity. When we think of collaboration, like in a crisis mode, how do you want people to act and do things together? Again, like the play side of it. I could think of like role playing different scenarios, asking questions within it, like that organization, that team will be better prepared to battle any type of crisis mode. I think of long ago, I'd worked in an airline, and it was during 9/11, and even with then I can reflect back that we did have to go into play mode to really create and think of all the different scenarios to prepare for. And while that's an extreme version of crisis and crisis modes, when I think of, all right, stable state business, you have competitors that are coming in, like how do you really unpack and understand that? You do have to turn yourself, not like believing our thing is the best and this is the only way to go, but you have to tap into that inquisitive nature or of really deeply inquisitive on each of those competitors and even play out, okay, what would they do, how would they do it, and that I easily see like how kids do it all the time. So from that standpoint, I think that's maybe one example I could give to help shape that.
So,
Elaine, what are some of the strategies you would coach a leader who's like, yeah, that sounds really good. I get what you're saying, but I have no idea how to do that. Like, how do I actually coach my team or be the person that's like, all right, I'm going to set something up so that we can do this?
Yeah, that the first part we touched on last week too is just like the starting point is to set the environment, and you've got to understand the barriers that exist for your team. Because as leaders, we can come in thinking that we know it and ask some questions, but some require more discovery than going straight to solutioning. Because I think as leaders too, we go in with our shoulds of like we're supposed to be there to solve things, and um, taking note of our own shoulds and opening that up also reflects with the team members regarding like, okay, like it is okay to ask, it is to discover a little bit more, it's okay to make mistakes, like from that as a baseline, it is very important and crucial to growth mindset, learning and being able to talk about the hard stuff. So it does come from the leader to establish that environment. And secondly, establishing what that common goal is from what that, whether it be a business objective to how they want the team to collaborate, but having some guideposts is important because free play, we've seen kids free play, like we were just chatting earlier before we started recording about how kids can find and make anything out of even trash, right? But if for your organization, your goal is not to make something from trash, but from something else, like those are kind of the goals that you want to set. And yes, there's a good time to do full on unrestricted, brainstorming without a goal. But without a goal, it can be very hard on an operational level as a business to like craft that and carry it into an outcome. So I think having that common goal is important. And kids do this actually when they're playing all together. They'll be like, "Hey, let's go build something," and they'll quickly kind of like discuss, move on to like their agreements already. Like, all right, you're gonna do that. Like, what do you do well? And they assign their roles. And if somebody doesn't like it, they're like, okay, they'll offer up other things very quickly. So they have this interesting way in which they're able to combine not only like where they thrive or their play type, and that's their like the sweet spot where they could play a long time, but also this kind of like servantship that they have of like, no, we have our goal of like building a Lego thing. And my daughter and her friends actually have this one where it's like I watch them on the side, and it was like all five of them navigated what they wanted to do and what they did well. Where all of a sudden it's like somebody is like shuffling through the different colors of Legos. The other one actually drew like what they were going to build together and like how many of each of the pieces. And the other ones started building. Like they all kind of like were able to do that. And I think first establishing an environment and what that goal is, like that's an example of what we could actually do in the adult work setting too.
I love I love the way you're framing that, because it's actually, we think of play as being unstructured, but it's actually, there's a structure there. And in some ways I think of, when people talk about structure or not structure, I think what they're really talking about is their rigid structure or sort of complex structure.
Yeah.
I think you're talking about complex structure. Like it's a structure. There's a process there, but it's driven by sort of observation. It's driven by intuition. It's driven by sort of taking what's found here and moving it into the next space. And I think like, and so part of me wonders, like, and I'd like to hear your thought, is like the difference between how we learn in our informal life to the difference to how we learn in our formal life, may be that school or learning in business.
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is I've been reflecting on this because as I've seen my kids get older, and in reflection of like how we were taught, like we have a didactic method of teaching here. And there are some pockets where it's like project-based learning, and there's that component. And for the majority of us, that kind of like there's the professor, they teach us, and then that's just kind of we test, and that's what's built into the system of when we think of like system and shoulds. And so that doesn't allow us fully to embrace the tries as when you think of like project-based learning or even how kids play, and that bravery side of it, testing different things, full on experimentation. And yes, there's going to be a lot of mistakes, but that is a more complex but enlightening way of learning, where even with all those mistakes, you actually grow faster within that to solve the problem and to solution to it. When I think of like fast forward, yes, I think that on the educational side, it can be a construct of constraint, as I had pointed out last week, like construct of constraint that we kind of just have to mobilize, like where are we in that needle and how far can we push it? And there are certain settings where, because of the other constructs that exist, we may not be able to push it as far as we personally may desire, but finding those pockets and windows in order for us to do it, even as organizations, is important to like pressure test things to help people learn a little bit more. When I think of like cross job applications, like how can, if somebody wants to learn this, like they should have a safe environment to be able to learn it if you want the longevity of that employee to develop a career. And again, creating that growth mindset then creates that satisfaction. It's that continuous cycle. So I think you're right, Zoltan. Like the education system side of it, that can be a definite construct of constraint, depending on how people were schooled and what they experienced, how much they embraced that, how much their family pushed it too. That takes some time to also recognize and break down. But finding those critical pockets of opportunities in order to tap into that full kind of take calculated risks, but really when we think of again, I always root a lot of inspiration from the kids, like that bravery to try. We really do need the bravery to try different skill sets, try different things we haven't done before in a somewhat low risk environment, so that when it is a higher risk environment, we have more intelligence around it in order to act.
Absolutely. You're reminding me of one of my favorite TED Talks. It's this guy Gever Tully. Have you heard of him? He does.
No, I haven't. Tell me more.
So he has this camp, and it's a tinkering camp. It's a tinkering school. And he has one talk where it's like why kids should do dangerous things. It's kind of interesting, but he has this whole thing about how people learn through tinkering, which is like you're just playing with things, right? And then
Experimenting. You're really experimenting. Yeah.
He had this one piece where, in this video, he shows the kids built this roller coaster, and they built like a bridge that they could walk between two trees, all made out of like those shopping bags, just things that they just played with and made. And they made boats, all kinds of stuff. But he says, that you as you're working through all this things, you get to a place where you're stuck. He says, and that's where kids start decorating. Like they stop working and they'll start like painting flowers on their things. And that's a pause that then allows them to think about, okay, so what's the next step? But I think that's really, for us as adult learners, it's like, how do you tinker around with things, play with them, but then how do you what do you do to allow that space of being stuck in a way, which is, I think it's an interesting process.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they're like playing together. I think that's another aspect too, to get a little unstuck, is find those opportunities. Again, you have to create the environment, otherwise this doesn't work at all. You like snuff out the fire like that. So like finding those other people that you can tinker together, really. Now I find it even on the kind of business side, like there are folks there that I connect with to just talk about the industry, and that ignites ideas, that ignites thoughts, and we're tinkering with ideas. Like that's my tinkering. But there are other things, like if you're tinkering with building things, to tinkering with many other levels, whether it be baking together, trying new foods together. Like there are a lot of elements that might seem minor, but when you really focus in on it, are avenues and opportunities for teams, really, and any connections and relationships side of it.
Yeah. Elaine, one of the things you just said, which I think is so key to all of this, and we keep coming back to, is that ultimately so much of this is just coming back to it. It's the conversation that we're having between one person and another. And that conversation and having the attitude of, I want to support you and have an open conversation, and to be in an environment where vulnerability is accepted enough to allow that conversation to facilitate growth. Because with that, we were talking about this last week, without the vulnerability, you can't learn anything. You're in a place of like, I legitimately don't know. And it's so frowned upon a lot of the time in business.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a barrier, that is a constraint that
Yeah.
keeps people from reaching their maximum potential, which is not good
Yeah.
for anybody.
Right. It's providing that vulnerability, or showing that provides the safety, right? To like, oh, I really don't know, and not have to think about am I going to get fired, or are they going to think this of me, or am I, like all of that.
Yeah.
Kids are able to innovate highly effectively because they actually don't have that in their toolbox at all. Like they're just like, I don't like this, or okay, yeah, I can do this. And do they like to do this? I'm just going to ask them, and seeing that come to life. And I think as you're saying that, it also brings up like the vulnerability, but also as leaders, to understand where our constraints may be is important, because without that, we can really restrict how we're receiving information or inviting others. So when we talk about like the diversity of ideas, um, it can, if you don't really ask the questions of what are the ways of working that my team members have, whether it be like how they need to do their thinking to how they need to share ideas. I had one client who was trying to drive collaboration within her team, and she was just like, I like, we always whiteboard. That's how I like to do things, and I can't get anybody to really share much. And we had to kind of step back and say, like, that's definitely her style of play. Like as she's like getting her ideas out, that's her way. It's not everybody else's way necessarily. I would even say like she's not only like, it's like extrovert, super extrovert, but some people need, their best way of working is actually to internalize that first, write it down. Okay, and then I can share, right? But being cognizant and not pushing one way, but being cognizant that there are a variety. So give a little bit of breathing room and space, because you'll be missing out on key conversations without that person, or that, you know, those five people's um, comments and inputs, because you kind of close them off just by the methodology or like their way of delivering or thinking about things. And
Yeah.
that's like, you know, the opposite of bringing in a diversity of idea. And when we think of innovation, it is different ideas from different inputs. And if you think about it, all of us have very different lived experiences. Yes, there's some commonalities, but that's what makes it all unique. So that all feeds into this process. So I think that's why it's important to, as leaders, to be cognizant that there are different styles and like thrive zones, and taking note of what those are really critical to success of a team.
So with that, like for me, I think that the physical environment is really important in encouraging play, right? There can be all different kinds of, for kids, it's outdoors, sometimes it's indoors, sometimes it's, in water, sometimes it's, like, so for companies that you see really bringing play into the space, like what do they do in the physical environment? Like what's the stuff of business play?
Mm-hmm. Well, and physical environments, like it's not about, I would say, the stuff. It's about the space. It's about the setting, and the people itself, and that's where that kind of play mindset and really tapping into the neuroscience of play really helps. I haven't seen organizations do it 100%, and they don't do it all the time, and that's okay, right? But starting to pave some path of like, all right, this is the time. It's for this project that we're gonna, call it the Blue Sky Project or whatever. But that everybody is able to get involved, that wants to get involved, is able to play in that area. But there's small things, Olten, I would say, like even on a hybrid model, like really just getting, like, because a lot of our virtual setting, it's become quite transactional.
Yeah.
And even the
Very
simple
true.
questions of like asking about people's background, like their Zoom background, like just it's a like low bar. Just be
Yeah.
like, what is that? Like lean into that curiosity. I mean, I have practiced that myself, where it's like, oh, like this partner we were working with, I inquired about this picture in his background, and turned out this was like something he drawn when he was like 14, and he won a competition, and we got into this whole story, right? But it's those stories that really drive that human connection that at the end of the day you do need on a business standpoint to
Totally.
collaborate, to have that trust. And so I would say, even on a very, very simple level, like just get curious about people's backgrounds, and then like lean into like when they're sharing something. Like I was at a pottery studio earlier this week, and it was like this gentleman was sharing with me that he had moved from Indiana to Greenville, South Carolina, and I was like, "Oh, tell me more. What made you move it?" Right? So it's those, if we start shaping them and practicing that, we will actually do that. Then like, oh, tell me more. Like I wonder why. Like when I gave that example of when they were saying like, why are they doing that? Well, then you can actually be like, oh, I wonder why they did that. Like what inputs did they get that drove them to that decision? Did someone tell them to do something that they thought they had to listen to? Like, that's actually when you can unpack like some organizational things that you might need to change in order to get full like change management within that whatever you're trying to hit, whether it be like a financial goal or an operational goal. It's only with those types of questions and that level of curiosity that you'll really, really start making change happen.
I often joke my entire success in my career has been based on 5 words. Tell me more about that.
That's so funny. I know. As you were saying that, Elaine, I was like, "Oh, Zoltan, this is his favorite thing."
That's it. He's practicing. Like he already has that pathway over
But,
and over again.
you know, working 20 years with kids, you
Yeah.
know, they're naturals about it. I mean, they will tell you more. And sadly, what happens is that as kids get older,
Yep.
they start to learn the rules and they start telling you less, right? But
Yep.
so how do we keep that open? So like this is, you know, it becomes a natural thing of I'm going to, you know, I'm not going to just like the first statement is the opening to the interesting part, right?
Yeah. No, and I think your observation too on like how kids grow up and how they start learning these rules. And as we get older, some of these rules and we start living life, we can pause and it feels like, wait a minute, I'm like living a life that's not totally mine. And that's when we all of a sudden need to assess like, oh, whoa, 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 like, yeah, there's rules, these constraints, but like, are they really mine? Do I really want them as I move forward, or do I like keep them back there because I don't, that's not me? And really taking that like assessment to then move forward to say like, what are my, what am I going to agree to? So, you know, we talked, I think you all use like the guiding principles. It's like these both foster and are embedded in personal and also professional. And just to finish off the personal thought, it's like, as we live life, like those kids, like we grow up with those, like we have to decide which ones we move forward with, which ones we park on the side, because it can feel very restrictive. And to say that they can, we can always be that 5-year-old kid and
Yeah.
ask everything. Sure, there's like social nuances we have to be aware of and things like that. But once in a while, to tap into that is so enriching in discovery and seeing the world in awe, connecting with folks that it's okay to do it once in a while.
And even if
Couldn't
you're
agree
not,
more.
even if you're not saying it out loud, to have it in your head, right? I mean, it's just like the living our lives so that there's rich, you know, sort of monologue going on or dialogue going on in our head that it can be spoken, but it's also there. You know, it makes us
Yeah.
that curiosity. You know.
Yeah. And just, I think practicing it, like even if it's in your head, that's your practicing, right? And then soon you'll hear it. I know I make a conscious effort to lean into some curiosity too and demonstrate it with my own kids. Well, I wonder why, or if they draw a conclusion from like my twin 11-year-olds have a 6-year-old sister, so there's a lot of 11-year-olds are kind of getting to that like, all right, I know this, you don't know this. So, but I model that like, how do we actually get curious of like, oh, what did she learn, or you know, things like that. Again, like just trying to prevent them from losing that pathway. How about that?
Exactly.
Well, your kids are going to be the most highly sought after talent for innovation teams and people trying to make the next big thing, which is perfect because you're in Silicon Valley and as part of the culture there. I think that's something that Elaine and I met in Silicon Valley, and we, I think that's something that when we put these rigidity ideas into people's heads, it it can really be damaging. And when you have too many like it needs to be done this particular way, then you miss out on stuff. And
Mm.
I think the thing that is engaging for people is for everybody to be collaborating on it. We've been talking, you know, indirectly about collaboration this whole time, but when you're in a team where, I mean, that's, I think, the part of the magic of Silicon Valley and why it's such a special place, in my opinion, is because you have these groups of people who are getting together to more or less play, to try something that nobody has tried before, and it probably won't yield anything. In 90% of cases, it doesn't work, but you try anyway, because there's something to be said for that. And it's yielded some of the coolest things that we all interact with and probably take for granted today. But it's because of somebody's willingness to experiment and fail a lot. And, I think that is something that we can all learn from, and hopefully, as Silicon Valley is not without its own problems, that it can remember that doing this kind of thing is really foundational to pushing humanity forward, to like really thinking about how are we playing around with this, like how can we all engage in this together. I think it's such a powerful thing that we can do. And I think there's so many different little ways that this can show up for people, but the conversation's important. So if you're listening to this, thank you for being a part of the solution and not the problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I just add the last little bit is like the bravery to try, experiencing failure. That is all part of the learning process. And it's while it may feel like, yeah, Silicon Valley has a lot of that, there are some elements that you don't have to be from Silicon Valley to experience that. Really just tapping into those questions. And it doesn't have to be cavalier in the trying. It can be in uh, a I'm just thinking of play words right now, in a particular sandbox, right? So there's still some goals, some guidelines, but everybody has agreed to them, not constraints in the sense of like it must be done this way. If there is that conversation within an organization and a team that's needing to build something and it has to be done this way, that team being able to, and the leader within that team being able to push back, just to ask the question of, is there a reason why it has to be that way? Right? Just starting that. If there are reasons, you can embed that in part of the thinking, but creating that safe sandbox to experiment. Again, like experimenting can be like lots of different risk levels. The best play happens when you start off with the lower risk, but creating that environment first so that then you are more capable to handle the larger risk items.
And I think part of it in that collaboration is being clear, like when we're doing whatever brainstorm we're doing or whatever collaboration we're doing, is the intent of this to focus on the box of the sandbox, or is the intent to focus on the play, right? And because I think sometimes I know sometimes I've seen situations where people are being encouraged to just throw out ideas and get into that play mode, and then suddenly there's like bam, like, oh no, we're not going there. And that's now the rules have now closed in on that brainstorm. And I think it's an interesting thing for leadership to be thinking, so how do we signal that this is not a play conversation? This is something where we got to talk about keeping the thing moving forward versus the innovative.
Yeah, I would say it could still be a play conversation, but I think you have to establish what that goal is first.
Yes.
Right, like the kids with the we're going to build this thing as high as we can, like that's the goal. And they talk about it first before they start brainstorming the how and all that. And then even if it's like, what are we going to build, there's still guidelines and guideposts as a business, because I think it's very hard to, when I think of all the interviews I did and it's like the how do you integrate, it is very hard to just say like just play into it. No, like how do we actually implement it within? And it is, you do need to build a little bit of a sandbox. I'm not saying it has to be all the rules and regulations, but if you are already know ones that have to be true, some I've seen like, all right, we can't do a deal unless it's like X number of millions of dollars within 3 years. There are some business rules to be had around it, but then the rest, let the rest go wherever it may go. And then you can start ranking. And then that's how you can kind of funnel through and filter like what's that true opportunity that you'll then move forward with.
Absolutely.
So good, Elaine. We've been talking about this stuff so often in these workshops. So there's all these different little ideas about how to create the rules and build the sandbox. I like to think about like the edges of the sandbox. That's all you're doing. You can build whatever you want inside, but if there is no edge to the sandbox, over time the sand just spreads out and it becomes unusable. So the edges are actually the part that create the sustainability of the play in the sandbox.
Yeah,
So
that's a good word, sustainability, because there can be a time and place where it's free play, and that can
yeah,
ignite different parts of the brain. But as for businesses, we're still owed to outcomes and things like that. You do
definitely.
need you do need to shape that to keep it sustainable.
I love it.
But it's one of my favorite quotes. I think it was Goethe who said, "It's quote the artist is he who dances in chains," which is kind of an interesting, because we all have our, if we're a painter, we have our canvas. That's our boundary. We have the limitations of the actually how do you maximize the play in that space, in those bounds, in the limitations. I think that's just a really interesting puzzle, and constantly.
Yeah, like environment. Where are those bounds? Where are you? What environment are you in, even with those bounds? Right. That definitely has an impact.
I love it. All
Can I
right,
ask,
Elaine, do
can
you
I ask
want to tell what was that, Sultan?
I just want to take a cue from you. I'm looking at that interesting ceiling behind you. You said you were in a cafe, but it looks like an airplane.
Oh, yes. I think it used to be a mill, an old mill, converted
Huh.
into a very large coffee shop, because our internet at home was a little wonky. So, yes, thanks. Yeah, it's a first time here. So, in my hometown, which this doesn't exist when I was growing up. So, it's kind of cool to see it. And it kind of feels like Austin, if you've ever been to Austin. So, yeah, thanks for taking the cue.
I love it. Elaine, do you want to tell people about your conference that you've got coming up or anything else that I know you have myplaytype.com. Where else can people find you online?
Yeah, sure. So we're doing it. If you are interested in having a larger impact and changing your ripples into waves, we have a ripple to wavemakers.com. We're having a summit and we'd love to see you there. So just head over there and sign up. Thanks for
Awesome.
having
Well,
me.
so good to see you and have you, Elaine. This was so fun. And we got some incredible, like just people very positive on LinkedIn. So hopefully they're listening to this. If you are, thanks everyone. It's really, really nice
Thanks.
to see all your names all the time. We're just really grateful for it. And thank you, Elaine.
Thanks.
Thank
Take care.
All right,
Bye.
everyone. See you next week.